This isn't a tale of holy men in white robes whispering prayers under candlelight. No. Tonight we walk to the smoke and blood of one of the most corrupt institutions in human history. At its worst, we're going to peel back the gold-lined curtains of the Vatican to reveal what they don't teach you in Sunday school. Beneath the stained glass and Latin hymns lies a centuries-long trail of scandal, deception, and outright horror. Because not every man who sat on the throne of St. Peter did so with a clean conscience. Some ruled the church like a personal kingdom. Others treated it like a brothel. And a few, well, they turned the papacy into a battlefield soaked in sin. From selling salvation for gold, to putting dead men on trial, to declaring themselves gods among men. This is a story of the worst popes in history. But before we dive in, take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy history that's raw, unfiltered, and a little unsettling. We don't shy away from the dark corners of the past here. And trust me, you're going to be notified when we uncover what's behind the next door. Hit the button. Leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Tonight's story may just keep you up longer than you planned. Let's begin our descent with the tale of Pope John XII, a man whose very reign feels like a medieval fever dream. He became pope at just 18 years old. That's not a typo. 18. While most teenagers were squires or monks in training, John, born Octavianus, was elevated to the highest spiritual seat in the Western world. But this was no divine calling. It was pure nepotism. His father, Alberic II of Spoleto, a powerful Roman noble, ensured his son inherited the papacy before he died. This wasn't about God. It was about power. And John treated it that way from the moment he slipped on the papal tiara. Roman historians of the era didn't mince words. They accused him of turning the Lateran Palace into a brothel. Prostitutes roamed sacred halls. Holy relics were pawned off to fund his pleasures. Rather than preaching sermons, he toasted pagan gods during orgies. Bishops gambled with him at the same tables where decisions about Christendom were supposed to be made. John's papacy wasn't just a moral disaster. It was a political one. He angered his allies, most notably the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I. Their fragile alliance collapsed after John secretly conspired with Otto's enemies behind closed doors. Otto responded not with diplomacy, but with an army. He marched on Rome and summoned a synod to investigate the pope. The list of charges was staggering. Simony, murder, incest, invoking demons. These weren't whispers. They were sworn accusations made by bishops under oath. John XII was deposed. But like any good Roman drama, that wasn't the end. With the help of angry Roman mobs, John clawed his way back to power and wasted no time in exacting revenge. He mutilated his enemies, executed clergy who had dared speak against him, and resumed his campaign of debauchery as if nothing had happened. And then came his end. Sudden, scandalous, and entirely fitting. In 964, Pope John XII died under mysterious circumstances. Some accounts claim he was murdered by a jealous husband who caught him in bed with his wife. Others suggest he had a stroke mid-act during one of his many adulterous encounters. Either way, he didn't die with dignity. He died as he lived, surrounded by sin. Even centuries later, his name echoes in infamy. Pope John XII didn't just embarrass the church. He violated it. He weaponized its authority to indulge every carnal desire. In the long annals of church history, his reign stands out not just for its depravity, but for how brazenly he wore his sins. And yet, he was only the beginning. Because if you thought John XII was the low point, think again. The next pope didn't just disgrace the office, he sold it. Literally that if Pope John XII was a church's teenage disaster, a hormonal storm and a mitre, then Pope Benedict IX was its living paradox, a man who refused to stay gone. He didn't just take the throne once, or twice. He wore the papal crown 3 separate times. And each return was more chaotic, more disgraceful than the last. If the Vatican had revolving doors in the 11th century, Benedict IX would have spun through them with a goblet of wine in one hand and a bag of gold in the other. Let's rewind to the beginning. Born Theophylactus of Tusculum around the year 1012, Benedict IX was thrust into the papacy by his aristocratic family, one of the most powerful in Rome. When they weren't throwing lavish banquets or settling rivalries with daggers, the Tusculani were busy manipulating papal elections like mafia bosses. So, it came as no surprise when their barely legal son was elected pope at around age 20. But young Benedict wasn't pious. He wasn't wise. And he certainly wasn't interested in saving souls. Chroniclers of the time didn't even attempt subtlety. They called him a disgrace. Accusations swirled of rape, adultery, and black magic. He hosted orgies in the Vatican and openly mocked the sanctity of his office. One historian claimed he lived a life so vile, so foul, so execrable that I shudder to think of it. And remember, this was a time when even the definition of vile had a higher tolerance than today. The Roman populace, long used to political corruption, finally had enough. Uprisings forced Benedict from the papal seat, but he wasn't finished. Like a stubborn wine stain, he returned, then left, then came back again. But what truly cemented his legacy as one of the worst popes wasn't the sin. It wasn't even the blackmail or the debauchery. It was what he did next. He sold the papacy. That's right. He literally offered a hand over the highest office in Western Christendom in exchange for cold, hard gold. He approached his godfather, John Gratian, a respected priest known for his integrity, and struck a deal. Gratian, believing he could bring peace and order, paid up and became Pope Gregory VI. But Benedict, being Benedict, had regrets. Maybe he missed the power. Maybe he missed the money. Or maybe he just didn't like being told no. Whatever the reason, he tried to take back the papacy. Not once, but twice. The result? Chaos.
At one point, there were 3 men claiming to be pope, each with a faction, each excommunicating the other, and each turning the spiritual capital of the Christian world into a theological circus. The legitimacy of the church crumbled before the eyes of Europe. Even the most loyal believers started asking, if the popes can't figure out who's in charge, why should we trust any of them? The mess grew so unbearable that the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry III, had to intervene. He summoned a council at Sutri in 1046. The decision was swift. Remove all 3 claimants. Wipe the slate clean. Try again. Benedict IX was excommunicated again. Gregory VI was forced to resign. A new pope was appointed under imperial authority. But the damage had already been done. Benedict IX had shattered the illusion that the papacy was divinely ordained and above worldly corruption. He treated the throne of St. Peter like a family heirloom, a pawn in a twisted game of power and gold. He eventually disappeared from the public eye, dying sometime after 1056, likely still excommunicated. No choir sang for him, no church bells tolled, and no monument marks his grave. Today, Benedict IX is remembered as the pope who made a mockery of sacred office, who turned divine authority into a commodity, who sold not just his soul, but the soul of the church itself. But as scandalous as that sounds, our journey is far from over, because there was one pope whose very name has become a byword for corruption, a man who turned the papacy into a family business, and the Vatican into the setting of one of the most infamous banquets in history. If there's a name that echoes through history whenever whispers of church corruption arise, it's Borgia. Say it aloud, and you can almost taste the poison in the air. No pope has ever embodied the phrase, absolute power corrupts absolutely, quite like Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia. His papacy wasn't just scandalous. It was legendary for its excess, its nepotism, and the way it turned the Holy Office into a playground for one of the most ruthless families in Europe. Rodrigo Borgia became pope in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed west under a Spanish flag. But while the New World was being discovered, the Old World watched in stunned fascination as the Vatican became a den of political intrigue, bribery, and outright hedonism. From the very start, Alexander VI didn't hide how he got there. He bought his way into the papacy with a campaign of lavish bribes and backroom deals. The conclave that elected him was less a holy gathering and more a high-stakes auction. Cardinals were showered with gifts, promises, and power. And when the final votes were counted, Rodrigo had won the keys to the kingdom of heaven through very earthly means. Once enthroned, he wasted no time making the Vatican serve the Borgia name. His first order of business? Elevate his children, yes, his children, to positions of enormous influence. Despite the vow of celibacy, Rodrigo had fathered multiple children with several mistresses. Most notably, Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. Cesare, originally made a cardinal, soon traded in his robes for armor, becoming more of a mafia don than a church leader. He commanded armies, assassinated rivals, and built a fearsome reputation across Italy. Lucrezia, meanwhile, became the subject of endless rumors, some of which were likely exaggerated, others disturbingly plausible. Accusations of incest, murder, and manipulation swirled around her name like incense in a dark cathedral. Some painted her as a pawn, others as a puppet master. But in either version, her father was always the one pulling the strings. Alexander VI didn't just use the church for personal gain. He defiled its very image. One of the most infamous events under his reign was the Banquet of the Chestnuts, an orgy held in the Vatican in 1501. 24 prostitutes were invited to entertain guests. Naked dancers performed while coins were tossed onto the floor to see who could collect them in the most obscene ways. It was a spectacle of decadence, with Alexander reportedly watching from his throne like a Roman emperor reborn. And while the Vatican descended into vice, he continued selling ecclesiastical titles to the highest bidders. Cardinalships, bishoprics, none were awarded for merit, only money. The church was no longer a vessel of faith, but a financial machine. Under his leadership, spiritual authority was openly exchanged for influence and wealth. It was faith turned into currency. Strangely, despite the orgies and nepotism, Alexander VI was also a capable administrator. He strengthened the papal states, improved infrastructure, and commissioned art from masters like Pinturicchio. In a different life, he might have been remembered for his strategic mind. But history doesn't forget sins so easily, especially not the kind that took place under the dome of St. Peter's. He died in 1503 under suspicious circumstances. Some say he was accidentally poisoned, ironically while attempting to poison a rival. His corpse swelled rapidly after death, reportedly to the point that it wouldn't fit in his coffin. He was buried quickly and with little ceremony. The stain he left behind, however, was indelible. To this day, Pope Alexander VI is widely considered the most scandalous pope in history. He didn't merely indulge in sin, he weaponized it. He turned the Vatican into a stage for ambition, turning love into power plays and power into currency. The Borgia name still lingers in the air like smoke after a fire, choking, unforgettable. But not all papal horror is about sex, greed, or political power. Some popes left a legacy so grotesque, so theatrically absurd, that even their enemies were left speechless. What happens when revenge follows a man beyond the grave? What happens when a corpse stands trial? You've heard of corruption. You've heard of murder, sex scandals, and bribes. But what if I told you that one pope dragged a corpse out of its tomb, dressed it in sacred robes, propped it up on a throne, and screamed accusations at it in a courtroom filled with horrified onlookers? No, this isn't fiction. It's one of the most surreal and grotesque moments in church history. It's called the Cadaver Synod, and at the center of this macabre theater was Pope Stephen VI, a man whose thirst for revenge knew no limits, not even death. Let's set the stage. The year is 897. Rome is a political powder keg. Rival factions, noble families, bishops, and military powers are battling for control of the papacy, and the church itself is little more than a pawn in their bloody chess game. Into this chaos steps Stephen VI, a pope handpicked by the powerful Spoleto family. But Stephen had a score to settle, and that score was with his predecessor, Pope Formosus. There was just one problem. Formosus was dead, buried, gone. But for Stephen, that wasn't enough. He wanted to erase Formosus's legacy, humiliate him, destroy him. And so he did something that defied reason, morality, and even sanity. He ordered Formosus's corpse exhumed. The decaying body was dragged from its grave, clothed in full papal vestments, and seated upright in the Lateran Basilica, the same sacred hall where councils and ceremonies were traditionally held. It wasn't a private inquisition. It was a public spectacle. With hundreds of clerics and nobles watching in stunned disbelief, Stephen held what became known as the Synodus Horrenda, the Cadaver Synod. He assigned a deacon to act as the corpse's defense lawyer, speaking on behalf of the rotting pope, while Stephen hurled accusation after accusation: perjury, violating canon law, and unlawfully ascending to the papacy. As the stench filled the air and the body slumped on its throne, supported by attendants, the trial proceeded. Eventually, the verdict was read. Guilty. The punishment? Formosus's corpse was stripped of its sacred garments. The fingers on his right hand, used for blessings, were severed. The body was then dragged through the streets and unceremoniously tossed into the Tiber River. A papal funeral turned to desecration. Justice replaced with vengeance. And all of it was calculated. You see, condemning Formosus posthumously wasn't just about revenge. It was a deeply political move. By invalidating Formosus's papacy, Stephen could erase the legitimacy of the bishops and clerics Formosus had ordained. That meant Stephen could replace them with loyalists, men who would owe their status to him and him alone. It was power consolidation, pure and simple. But Rome is a city with a long memory and a short temper. The public was outraged. Riots erupted. The grotesque spectacle of the Cadaver Synod turned even Stephen's allies against him. Just a few months after the trial, the tide turned. Stephen VI was imprisoned by his enemies. Not long after, he was strangled in his cell, murdered the way tyrants often are, in silence and darkness. After his death, the church scrambled to undo the damage. Formosus's corpse was recovered and reburied with honor. The decisions of the Cadaver Synod were officially nullified. Future popes declared that such a travesty must never be repeated. But the stain remained. The image of a decomposed body on trial, of a pope screaming at a corpse, is one of the most haunting in all of religious history. It wasn't just grotesque. It was absurd. A moment where the authority of the church didn't just falter, it crumbled into dark comedy. The sacred became theatrical. The Vatican became a stage for vengeance. And Stephen VI secured his place not as a leader of the faithful, but as the architect of one of history's most macabre spectacles. And yet, absurdity was only one flavor of papal horror. Not all popes wore smiles while they sinned. Some ruled with fear, paranoia, and violence. Some didn't throw orgies. They threw their enemies in dungeons and let them rot. And the next man in our story didn't just damage the church. He helped shatter it. When you think of a corrupt pope, you might picture lavish banquets, gold-lined robes, and whispered backroom deals. But Pope Urban VI was none of that. He wasn't a playboy or a schemer. He was something far more terrifying, an iron-fisted tyrant in holy vestments. His reign, beginning in 1378, didn't corrupt the church with indulgence. It cracked it apart with violence, paranoia, and rage. Urban VI didn't just rule badly. He was a spark that helped ignite one of the most catastrophic schisms in church history, a split that fractured Europe and nearly destroyed the papacy itself. His real name was Bartolomeo Prignano, an Italian archbishop with a reputation for discipline and austerity. When he was elected pope, it was largely to appease Roman mobs who were demanding an Italian pontiff after a long line of French popes. The cardinals obliged, and Urban VI ascended the papal throne with a quiet dignity. For a brief moment, it looked like he might be the reformer the church so desperately needed. But then everything changed. As soon as he secured power, Urban revealed his true self. He wasn't pious. He wasn't diplomatic. He was volatile, mercurial, and utterly consumed by suspicion. He began berating cardinals in public, accusing them of conspiracies without evidence. His temper was legendary. He lashed out at advisors, beat staff members for minor mistakes, and surrounded himself with brutes who enforced his will without question. The cardinals who had elected him quickly realized they'd made a mistake. Urban wasn't just difficult. he was dangerous. Several of them fled Rome, regrouping in Avignon, and declared his election invalid. They argued that the conclave had been coerced by mob violence, that Urban's insanity disqualified him from office, and that a new pope must be chosen. And so, they elected Clement VII as a rival pope. Two popes, two courts, two visions of the church. This was the beginning of the Western Schism, a nearly 40-year crisis where Europe was split between competing popes, each claiming to be the one true heir of St. Peter. Nations were forced to pick sides. France, Scotland, and Spain backed Clement in Avignon. England, most of Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire remained loyal to Urban in Rome. The unity of Western Christendom shattered. The church became a battlefield, its authority diluted, its credibility bleeding from every corner. And Urban VI didn't blink. Instead of seeking reconciliation, he doubled down on his paranoia. When cardinals who once supported him expressed concern, he accused them of treason. He had them arrested, imprisoned, and tortured. Reports from the time speak of horrific screams echoing through the halls of the Vatican. Some cardinals were starved. Others were beaten. 5 were executed without trial. Urban's reign became a reign of terror. He excommunicated his enemies en masse, refused any attempt at compromise, and retreated deeper into isolation. He surrounded himself with loyalists, not theologians or men of faith, but sycophants and muscle. Diplomacy gave way to decrees. Faith gave way to fear. Meanwhile, the schism he helped create dragged on. Rival popes battled not with swords, but with edicts. Entire nations switched allegiances. Clergy were torn between obedience and survival. The moral fabric of the church frayed until it was nearly beyond repair. Urban VI died in 1389, alone and despised. He left no legacy of reform, no theological insights, no spiritual guidance. Only the trail of broken trust and ecclesiastical carnage. Even his death failed to bring peace. The schism continued for decades after, spawning a third pope at one point, and ultimately requiring a massive council in the 15th century to restore unity. But the damage was done. Urban's story is a reminder that not all evils wear silk and gold. Sometimes they wear discipline like armor. Sometimes the worst popes don't indulge, they destroy. Urban VI turned the church into a prison, a place where fear ruled and mercy died. And he showed that the papacy, for all its holy trappings, could fall prey to something far more corrosive than lust or greed, rage. Yet just when you think the corruption couldn't get any worse, when you think the papacy had hit bottom, it managed to dig even deeper. Because the next pope didn't just sell indulgences or rule with violence. He bankrupted the very soul of salvation. Coming up, we turn to Pope Leo X, the Renaissance prince who turned forgiveness into a product and helped set the world on fire.
If some popes erred through rage and others through vice, Pope Leo X erred through luxury, a decadence so blinding, so gilded, that he failed to notice the world cracking beneath his feet. His was a reign of beauty, splendor, and Renaissance brilliance, but also one of spiritual decay and financial ruin. He didn't commit murder or torture cardinals. No, his sin was subtler, and in many ways more devastating. Under his watch, salvation itself was sold for a price. And it was this corruption that helped unleash one of the most transformative upheavals in Western history, the Protestant Reformation. Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X in 1513. He was the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the famed Florentine ruler and patron of the arts. Giovanni was bred not for the altar, but for the throne. As a child, he was appointed a cardinal. As a man, he inherited a church bloated with wealth and riddled with factions, and he brought to it the swagger of a Renaissance prince. One of his first reported remarks after his election set the tone: "God has given us the papacy. Let's enjoy it." And enjoy it he did. Under Leo X, the Vatican transformed into a palace of indulgence. Art, music, literature, and architecture flourished. The works of Raphael adorned the walls. Gold leaf dripped from ceilings. Feasts were held that rivaled the courts of kings. He loved theater, poetry, and elaborate spectacles. He was not a spiritual shepherd. He was a cultural impresario. And to finance it all, he drained the church's coffers with reckless abandon. When the money ran dry, Leo turned to an old but increasingly dangerous source of revenue: indulgences. Indulgences weren't new. For centuries, the church had granted remission of temporal punishment for sins through acts of charity, prayer, or pilgrimage. But under Leo, indulgences became monetized, sold openly across Europe as certificates of divine forgiveness. The message was clear: pay a fee and your sins, or the sins of your dead relatives, could be erased. One Dominican friar, Johann Tetzel, took the sales pitch to chilling heights. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. To many, it sounded like salvation was for sale. And among the many who were disgusted was a German monk named Martin Luther. In 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, a direct attack on the corrupt practice of indulgent sales. He wasn't trying to break the church. He wanted reform, debate, accountability. But Leo X didn't take him seriously. He dismissed Luther as a drunken German who would change his mind once he sobered up. Luther didn't. Instead, he escalated. Leo responded with a papal bull excommunicating Luther in 1521. It was a fatal miscalculation. Luther, backed by sympathetic princes and a population tired of ecclesiastical exploitation, refused to back down. The Reformation exploded across Europe. Churches broke away. Monasteries emptied. And for the first time in a millennium, Western Christianity fractured irreparably. Leo X died later that same year, oblivious of the scope of the storm he had helped unleash. He left behind a church in turmoil, a treasury in debt, and a legacy not of theology or sanctity, but of excess. His pontificate is remembered less for its cultural brilliance and more for the commodification of grace. He had turned the keys of heaven into coins, and the repercussions would echo for centuries. In a way, Leo X was the culmination of centuries of rot. Where John XII had gambled away relics, Leo sold redemption. Where Alexander VI had turned the papacy into a family business, Leo turned it into an art gallery funded by eternal souls. He didn't break the church. He lit the match that exposed the tinder. And while the Vatican reeled from the Reformation, its past still cast long, dark shadows. Because the road to Leo had been paved by centuries of sin, and the man who helped lay its foundations did so with seduction, assassination, and dynasty in mind. Next, we descend even deeper into the rule of Pope Sergius III, the father of the pornocracy, a pope who turned the papacy into a bloodline. Long before Leo X sold indulgences and long before Martin Luther cracked open Europe's religious fault lines, there was a pope who laid the groundwork for centuries of ecclesiastical rot. Not through policy or theology, but through violence, lust, and bloodline. His name was Pope Sergius III, and his papacy marked the beginning of what historians would later call the pornocracy, a nearly 60-year stretch during which the papal throne was not ruled by saints or scholars, but by one Roman family's incestuous grip on power, often through the influence of women behind the scenes. Yes, this was the era of the rule of harlots, and at the center of its storm stood Sergius III, the father of corruption, in the most literal sense. The year was 904. Rome, already a city in political and moral decay, was reeling from a succession of short-lived and violently deposed popes. The papacy had become less a divine office, and more a prize fought over by aristocratic clans. Sergius had already made one failed bid for the throne years earlier, but now, backed by the powerful Theophylact family, he seized the tiara by force. Rivals were assassinated. Streets ran with blood, and once installed, Sergius made no attempt to mask his methods. He was not a man of peace. He was a man of domination. But what truly defined his reign wasn't his cruelty. It was his relationship with a noble woman named Marozia, the daughter of Theophylact, and a teenager at the time Sergius took her as his mistress. Theirs wasn't merely a scandalous affair. It was a dynastic alliance, one that would shape the papacy for generations. From this union was born a son. That son, years later, would become Pope John XI. Let that sink in. A pope fathered another pope.
Marozia and her family didn't just influence the papacy, they controlled it. Through marriages, assassinations, and backroom deals, the Theophylax installed and removed popes at will. The Vatican became a family business. Spiritual merit meant nothing. Bloodline, alliances, and power games ruled. Sergius III's rise also marked a chilling reversal of papal policy. He restored the memory and legitimacy of Pope Formosus. Yes, the same pope whose corpse had been dragged into court by Stephen VI during the Cadaver Synod. Sergius undid those rulings, but not out of piety. It was revenge, political vengeance dressed in robes. He recondemned his enemies. Then he had Formosus's body reburied, only to dig it up again later to recondemn it once more. These weren't acts of spiritual guidance. They were mafia-style score settlings executed through religious theater. Under Sergius, the church became a hollow shell. He filled church offices with loyalists, many of whom had no spiritual qualifications at all. Simony, the selling of church positions, ran rampant. Bishops were appointed not for their virtue, but for their gold or their allegiance. Rome had always been a city of power struggles. Under Sergius, the struggle ended. Power won, and it wore a crooked mitre. He died in 911, still firmly in control, still feared by his enemies, but never revered. There were no tears from the faithful, no golden legacy, just silence, and the soft rustling of his dynasty extending its reach. What followed was a string of popes who were little more than puppets for the Theophylax and Marozia herself. Her lovers and sons took turns wearing the papal crown while Rome whispered of orgies, poisonings, and betrayals. The papacy during this time was not a spiritual beacon. It was a Roman soap opera, drenched in sin and dripping with power plays. Sergius III may not be a household name like Alexander VI or Leo X, but in many ways, he was their spiritual predecessor. He opened the floodgates. He set the tone. He made it acceptable for the papacy to become personal, dynastic, and transactional. He transformed the Vatican from the seat of Peter into the throne of a corrupt bloodline. And while some popes would later dress their corruption in velvet or Renaissance finery, Sergius made no such effort. His was a naked grab for power, rooted in lust and executed in blood. But perhaps no one embodied papal arrogance more completely than the man who came next. A pope who looked at emperors and declared himself above them, who tried to seize the reins of all Christendom not with faith, but with force. Coming up, we turn to Pope Boniface VIII, the pope who declared himself God's ruler on earth and paid the price that by the time Pope Boniface VIII rose to power in 1294, the Catholic Church was already a global force, wealthy, entrenched, feared. But Boniface didn't just see the papacy as a spiritual office. He saw it as a throne of supreme, earthly dominance. He didn't whisper prayers for guidance. He issued proclamations like royal decrees. And when he looked at the kings of Europe, he didn't see partners in Christendom. He saw subordinates. He would come to be remembered as the pope who tried to rule not just the church, but the world. And in doing so, nearly shattered the illusion of papal invincibility forever. Boniface VIII was born Benedetto Caetani into a powerful noble family in the Papal States. He was well-educated, cunning, and ambitious, traits that would serve him well in Roman politics, but proved disastrous on the world stage. His rise was marked by manipulation from the start. When Pope Celestine V, an elderly hermit-turned-reluctant pope, found himself overwhelmed by the pressures of leadership, Boniface allegedly pressured him into resigning. It was one of the rare times in history when a pope stepped down voluntarily. Boniface wasted no time. He seized the throne just 11 days later. And from that point on, he ruled with an iron will. He immediately set about asserting papal supremacy over secular rulers. Where previous popes had tried to navigate a tense balance between spiritual authority and royal power, Boniface swung the pendulum hard toward total domination. His most infamous declaration came in 1302 with the papal bull Unam Sanctum, in which he claimed that submission to the pope was absolutely necessary for salvation. He wasn't just suggesting spiritual obedience. He was placing the pope above kings, above emperors, above all mortal authority on earth. And he wasn't bluffing. One of his fiercest clashes was with King Philip IV of France, a monarch known for being ruthless, calculating, and entirely unwilling to bow. Tensions began over taxation. Philip wanted to tax clergy in France to fund his wars. Boniface said no. The Pope claimed only he had the right to impose such levies. Philip responded by forbidding the export of money from France to Rome, essentially choking off one of the Vatican's revenue streams. The battle quickly escalated. Boniface excommunicated Philip. Philip retaliated by launching a smear campaign, accusing the Pope of heresy, corruption, and even witchcraft. He claimed Boniface kept a demon in a box, practiced black magic, and had committed unspeakable acts. And then, in 1303, the unthinkable happened. A French envoy, led by Guillaume de Nogaret and backed by Italian allies, stormed Boniface's residence in Anagni. They found the Pope alone, unprotected, and cornered. What happened next is the stuff of legend. Boniface, reportedly dressed in full papal regalia, sat defiantly on his throne. When confronted, he is said to have declared, "Behold my neck, behold my head," inviting them to strike him down like a martyr. Instead, they slapped him, a literal slap to the face of papal authority. Boniface was held prisoner for 3 days, humiliated and broken. Though local forces eventually freed him, the damage had been done. He returned to Rome in disgrace and died shortly after. Some say from illness, others from sheer rage and humiliation. But even in death, his enemies weren't finished with him. Years later, Boniface's body was exhumed by his critics who claimed it smelled of sulfur, a symbolic accusation that he had been damned. And when Dante Alighieri penned the Divine Comedy, he placed Boniface in the 8th circle of hell, reserved for corrupt churchmen and false prophets. His fall from grace was immortalized not just in history books, but in the very architecture of Christian myth. Boniface VIII is remembered not for theology or reform, but for hubris. He believed himself to be above kings, untouchable, unchallengeable. And in pushing the limits of papal supremacy, he provoked the greatest backlash the Church had seen in centuries. He tried to place the Church above all worldly power. Instead, he exposed its vulnerability. And while his reign marked the high-water mark of papal arrogance, it was far from the end of papal violence. Because the next pope in our journey didn't declare war on kings. He declared war on his own people. He weaponized the cross, turned theology into military doctrine, and bathed entire cities in blood. Next, we confront Pope Innocent III, the Crusader Pope whose wars were not just against infidels, but against fellow Christians. Few names in papal history carry as much paradox as Pope Innocent III. His name, Innocent, suggests peace, purity, divine compassion. But behind that name was a man whose pontificate bathed Europe in blood. He didn't just lead crusades against Muslims in the Holy Land. He unleashed war upon fellow Christians. He didn't just guide the faithful, he commanded armies. His was a reign of consolidation, ambition, and relentless violence disguised in the language of salvation. Elected in 1198 at the age of just 37, Lotario dei Conidi Segni became Pope Innocent III and quickly proved himself a master of both theology and realpolitik. Unlike many of the popes before him, Innocent was brilliant. He wrote treatises, interpreted law, and saw himself not merely as the Bishop of Rome, but as the Vicar of Christ, the living embodiment of God's will on earth. And he truly believed it. He once declared, "The successor of Peter is the Vicar of Christ, established as a mediator between God and man." That was not metaphor. That was his job description. And with that belief, he acted not as a humble servant, but as an emperor in holy robes. His ambitions first manifested in the Fourth Crusade, a campaign originally intended to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. But under Innocent's watch, it morphed into something grotesque. Due to political manipulation, Venetian scheming, and papal indulgence, the Crusaders never reached Jerusalem. Instead, in 1204, they turned on Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the East. What followed was one of the most brutal sackings in medieval history. Crusader knights looted churches, defiled relics, and slaughtered civilians. Gold and icons were ripped from altars. The Hagia Sophia, Christendom's crown jewel in the East, was desecrated. For 3 days, chaos reigned. Innocent was reportedly horrified at first, but then justified the attack as divine punishment for Orthodox schismatics. The papacy had sanctioned the destruction of one Christian civilization by another. But that was only the beginning. In 1208, Innocent launched the Albigensian Crusade, not against Muslims or pagans, but against heretical Christians in southern France. The Cathars, a sect that challenged the authority and opulence of the Roman Church, were gaining followers. They preached simplicity, rejected materialism, and refused to recognize papal authority. That was unacceptable, so Innocent declared war. The crusade lasted over 2 decades. What began as a religious purge turned into a genocidal campaign. Entire towns were razed. Civilians, men, women, and children were slaughtered indiscriminately. The phrase attributed to the papal legate at the massacre of Béziers became infamous. Kill them all. God will know his own. Estimates suggest tens of thousands were killed. Some put the number higher. Villages vanished. Cultures were erased. And all of it was done under the banner of holy righteousness, signed and sealed by the Pope himself. Innocent didn't stop there. He intervened in royal successions, excommunicated kings, and placed entire nations under interdict, a form of spiritual embargo where sacraments were suspended and churches closed. England, under King John, felt his wrath. After a dispute over the appointment of an archbishop, Innocent excommunicated John and suspended religious life across the kingdom for years. No baptisms, no weddings, no burials. The spiritual life of an entire nation held hostage to papal authority. Eventually, King John submitted, yielding to papal supremacy and even declaring England a vassal state to the Pope. Innocent, having proven his point, lifted the sanctions. By the end of his reign, Pope Innocent III had expanded the papacy's influence to heights never seen before. He wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was the central power broker of medieval Europe. He summoned kings, commanded armies, dictated laws, and redrew borders. And yet, for all his achievements, his legacy is soaked in blood. He institutionalized violence in the name of purity. He twisted theology into military doctrine. And he proved that even the most pious language can conceal terrifying ambition. Pope Innocent III didn't merely corrupt the church. He weaponized it. And while he ruled with iron discipline and legal authority, our next pope took a different approach. He ruled with wealth, with gold, with grandeur. He bathed the papacy in Renaissance luxury and commissioned beauty that still stuns the world today. But make no mistake, behind the art was a system just as rotten. Next, we return to opulence, to indulgence, to papal parties with no limits. Coming up, Pope Paul II, the peacock of the Vatican. If Pope Innocent III wielded power like a sword, Pope Paul II wore it like jewelry, literally. His was not the reign of a battlefield general or a theologian king. Paul II ruled with excess, vanity, and a love for spectacle so obsessive that even his robes became scandalous. He didn't launch crusades or rewrite doctrine. He reveled in appearance. But beneath the silks and sapphires, his pontificate helped cement the culture of self-indulgence and authoritarian control that would continue to rot the church from the inside out. Born Pietro Barbo in 1417, Paul II came from a wealthy Venetian family. His uncle was Pope Eugenius IV, and his career in the church was built on privilege and nepotism. From the start, Barbo was more interested in status and appearance than spiritual matters. As cardinal, he became infamous for his flamboyant fashion, wearing opulent rings, extravagant hats, and brocaded robes that would have embarrassed most princes. When he was elected pope in 1464, he immediately began reshaping the Vatican in his image, one of refined opulence, glittering beauty, and absolute control. One of his first acts was to reject a binding oath made by his predecessors that limited papal power. Paul II refused to be boxed in. He asserted that the Pope should answer to no one, not to councils, not to cardinals, and certainly not to tradition. He viewed any effort to constrain papal authority as a personal insult. And so, he governed as a dictator cloaked in velvet. He disbanded the College of Abbreviators, scholars and humanists responsible for drafting and preserving papal documents, because he thought them too arrogant, too independent, and too full of ideas that weren't his. Many of these scholars were part of the flourishing Renaissance humanist movement, men who revered classical literature, questioned authority, and embraced philosophical inquiry. Paul II saw them as a threat. When Rome's humanists criticized his actions, he lashed out. The most infamous example came with the arrest of Bartolomeo Platina, a respected historian and writer, along with several other scholars. Paul accused them of conspiracy and heresy, though no serious evidence was ever produced. They were imprisoned, interrogated, and tortured in the Castel Sant'Angelo. Their real crime? Challenging papal infallibility with reason and wit. Paul II's reign was marked by a growing cultural paranoia. He despised printing presses, fearing that books would erode clerical authority.
He banned the publication of certain texts and restricted intellectual freedoms. His actions stifled Rome's intellectual community, causing many scholars to flee or fall silent. But if he feared thought, he worshipped spectacle. Paul II was obsessed with public appearances and lavish ceremonies. He revived Roman-style pageantry, parading through the streets in dazzling attire, flanked by jewel-encrusted horses and golden carriages. His papal tiara was custom-made, larger, heavier, and more expensive than any before it. He hosted enormous carnivals filled with games, chariot races, and theatrical performances, all designed to cement the church's presence not in hearts, but in eyes. He even kept a menagerie of exotic animals at the Vatican to show off his wealth and worldliness. And yet, for all his vanity, he left no significant theological writings. He enacted no major reforms. His spiritual legacy was a void. His reign was style without substance, a performance in the grandest theater of Christendom. Paul II died unexpectedly in 1471, reportedly of a stroke, though rumors spread that he died during an erotic episode with a page boy. These whispers, though likely exaggerated, reflect how Rome viewed him, a pope obsessed with sensual pleasure, detached from faith and devoured by his own ego. After his death, Platina, the same man Paul had imprisoned and tortured, wrote the official biography of the pope. It was scathing. Platina described Paul II as vain, paranoid, cruel, and intellectually barren. And because Platina was respected and survived the pope who wronged him, his account became canon. Paul II's legacy is not one of murder or war. It is one of cultural regression. He wore beauty like armor and ruled with suspicion instead of insight. He feared books more than swords. He loved his own reflection more than his flock. And while his reign might seem tame next to the horrors of war or the depravity of sexual scandal, it laid groundwork for a church that prized appearance over soul, one where the throne of Peter became just another stage prop. But if Paul II's corruption was gilded, our next pope's was grotesque. Because what happens when a man's appetite knows no spiritual limits? When gluttony and lust consume the soul of the church? Coming up next, Pope Julius III, the pontiff who installed his teenage lover in the Vatican and dined while Christendom burned. Pope Julius III's papacy was not just a reflection of moral decay. It was a spectacle of indulgence, a carnival of debauchery and excess. Unlike many of his predecessors, Julius III did not cloak his sins in politics or theology. No, his depravity was raw, open, and shameless. He didn't just build grandiose buildings or fill the papal treasury. He filled the Vatican with sycophants, entertainers, and his own personal entourage, all at the expense of the church's spiritual mission. Giovanni Maria Sciacchi del Monte ascended to papacy in 1550, taking the name Julius III. His rise was not entirely surprising. Born into a wealthy and powerful family, Julius was an ambitious man who had already served in various ecclesiastical positions. His election as pope was more a matter of his family's influence than any divine calling. However, from the moment he took office, it was clear that his papacy would be marked not by theological contributions, but by a penchant for pleasure, luxury, and scandal. Julius III's greatest and most enduring scandal was his infamous relationship with a young boy named Innocenzo del Monte, the Pope's teenage companion, who would become a fixture of Julius's court. The story behind Innocenzo is a chilling one. The boy was adopted by Julius, though rumors swirled that their bond went far beyond that of a typical guardian and ward. Innocenzo lived in the papal palace, surrounded by the finest luxuries, while Julius lavished him with gifts and power. He wasn't just an adopted son. He was given the title of cardinal at a young age, a position that would have been unheard of for anyone without political ties, let alone a teenage boy with no qualifications. His rise within the Vatican was a glaring symbol of the Pope's corruption, as the Church's most sacred positions were sold to the highest bidder, or in this case, to the Pope's lover. Julius III's papacy also saw an enormous increase in the personal luxury of the Vatican. The Pope was known to throw extravagant banquets, host lavish festivals, and keep a lavish court. His palace was filled with the finest art, the most decadent furnishings, and a small army of servants to cater to his every whim. He took enormous pride in his garden, commissioning the famous Villa Giulia in Rome, a grandiose Renaissance palace filled with lush grounds and ornate sculptures. But while Julius III reveled in personal indulgence, the Church and the wider world suffered. During his reign, the Pope paid little attention to the needs of the faithful or the moral health of the Church. Instead of guiding the Church through the growing religious tensions in the aftermath of the Reformation, he immersed himself in personal pleasure, turning the Vatican into his private playground. For years, the Catholic Church struggled to recover its moral credibility in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, but Julius III's indulgences only worsened its already crumbling reputation. Perhaps the most telling example of his debauchery was his attitude towards the ongoing religious conflict. While the Protestant Reformation tore apart the fabric of Christendom, Julius III turned a blind eye to the cries of the faithful. His focus was entirely on the extravagance of his court, the power of his personal circle, and his indulgence in sensual pleasures. He paid no heed to the political and religious crises that rocked Europe, preferring to spend his days with artists, musicians, and entertainers. His reign was one of neglect for the spiritual well-being of the Church, and instead, the papacy became an institution rife with scandal, frivolity, and indulgence. Yet, even as Julius III lavished his wealth on himself, the world outside the Vatican crumbled. Italy was embroiled in religious and political strife. The Catholic Church's power was waning, its spiritual authority questioned by growing numbers of Protestants. Meanwhile, Julius's personal court remained an island of excess, a tragicomic contrast to the decaying state of the papacy he had inherited. Julius III's death in 1555 was as sudden as it was anticlimactic. He was struck down by a stroke at the age of 60, leaving behind a legacy not of spiritual reform or great works of charity, but of indulgence, nepotism, and a church tarnished by scandal. His death did not bring an end to the moral decay he had allowed to fester. Instead, it was merely the end of a chapter in the history of a papacy that had for too long been mired in worldly desires rather than spiritual leadership. And so, Pope Julius III joins a long list of pontiffs who tarnished the legacy of the papacy with their sins and excesses. His reign was a sobering reminder of how power, unchecked, can lead to corruption and how, when leaders prioritize personal gratification over duty, institutions crumble. But Julius III's indulgence wasn't the final chapter of papal corruption, because the next pope didn't just live in luxury. He sold indulgences himself, quite literally, with an unparalleled financial and spiritual price tag. Coming up, Pope Leo X, the pope who turned salvation into a commodity and set the stage for a religious upheaval that would shake Europe to its core. Pope Leo X stands as one of the most infamous figures in papal history, not because of his personal vices, but because of his institutionalization of the most financially and spiritually corrupt practices in church history. His papacy was a paradox of Renaissance splendor and ecclesiastical decay. On one hand, he was a patron of the arts, commissioning works from some of the greatest artists in history. On the other, he presided over the selling of indulgences on an unprecedented scale, turning the very concept of salvation into a commodity, and setting the stage for the most significant religious upheaval Europe had ever seen, the Protestant Reformation. Born Giovanni de' Medici in 1475, Leo X was the son of Lorenzo de' Medici, the renowned ruler of Florence. From a young age, Giovanni was steeped in the wealth, power, and luxury of the Medici family. He was groomed for greatness, but his path to the papacy was anything but spiritual. He became a cardinal at just 13 years old, purely due to his family's immense political influence. By the time he was elected pope in 1513 at the age of 38, he was already a man of wealth, leisure, and high society, with little to no interest in the deep religious responsibilities that came with the papacy. As Pope, Leo X was a Renaissance prince in every sense of the word. He was a lover of the arts, a connoisseur of fine wine, and a man who surrounded himself with the best and brightest minds of his time. He commissioned works from Raphael and Michelangelo, transforming the Vatican into a center of artistic and architectural grandeur. The Sistine Chapel ceiling, painted by Michelangelo, was but one of many iconic works to be produced under his reign. He threw lavish banquets, hosted grand festivals, and lived a way that even the wealthiest kings might envy. But despite his outward opulence, Leo X's papacy was marked by a profound failure to address the growing spiritual and financial issues within the church. In fact, his reign was a textbook example of how unchecked wealth and indulgence at the top can rot the institution from the inside out. Leo X's greatest sin was his financial corruption. The church, under his leadership, became a gargantuan economic machine designed not to serve the faithful, but to fill the coffers of Rome. One of his first acts as pope was to launch a massive campaign to fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, one of the largest and most awe-inspiring churches in the world. The cost of such an endeavor was astronomical, and the Vatican needed money, fast. To raise funds, Leo turned to the sale of indulgences. This was not a new practice, but Leo X took it to a new, almost industrial scale. Indulgences were essentially certificates that, for a price, promised to reduce the time a soul would spend in purgatory. The more money you paid, the more sins could be forgiven for both the living and the dead. This practice had been common for centuries, but Leo X's expansion of it made salvation something that could be bought and sold. By selling indulgences, the church turned the concept of divine grace into a transaction, a marketplace where salvation was no longer about repentance or prayer, but about wealth. The sale of indulgences didn't just go on unnoticed. It provoked outrage. One of the most vocal critics was a German monk named Martin Luther. In 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, condemning the selling of indulgences and the church's widespread corruption. He didn't intend to break away from the church. He simply wanted to reform it. But Leo X dismissed Luther's protests as nothing more than the ramblings of a drunken German. Luther's pleas for change went unheard. But Luther wasn't the only one angered by the sale of indulgences. As the practice spread across Europe, many began to see the church's actions as a blatant cash grab. The Vatican's greed became legendary, and it wasn't long before Luther's ideas gained traction, first among scholars and then across broader swathes of Europe. The Protestant Reformation had begun, and Leo X's negligence and excess were the spark that set it ablaze. In 1520, Leo X issued the papal bull Ex Surge Domini, condemning Luther and his ideas. It was a desperate move to maintain the church's authority, but only hardened Luther's resolve. The more Leo X attempted to suppress the Reformation, the more it grew. By 1521, Luther was excommunicated, and the Protestant movement was unstoppable. Leo X died in 1521, still clinging to his vision of a world where the church reigned supreme and salvation was for sale. But by then, the Protestant Reformation was already gaining steam, and Leo's financial corruption had ensured that his papacy would be remembered not for its religious devotion, but for its greed. The church that he had inherited, powerful and uncontested, was fractured forever, and Leo X, the Pope who turned salvation into a business transaction, left a legacy of scandal, division, and revolution in his wake. His reign was one of excess and arrogance, a papacy that saw the wealth and power of the Vatican as an end in itself, rather than a means of serving God. Pope Leo X didn't just fail in his spiritual duties. He triggered a religious upheaval that would change the course of history. But Leo X wasn't the only pope to leave a controversial legacy, because the next pope, whose tenure marked the beginning of a new era of papal warfare, took things to an even darker place. His was a reign that blurred the lines between sacred and profane and made the papacy an empire of brutality, conspiracy, and ruthless ambition. Next up, Pope Sixtus IV, whose reign set the stage for the bloody politics of the Borgia dynasty. Pope Sixtus IV was not a man known for his piety. No, Sixtus IV, born Francesco della Rovere in 1414, was a pope of ruthless ambition, cunning political maneuvers, and unapologetic power plays. His reign, which lasted from 1471 to 1484, marked the beginning of an era of papal politics that blurred the lines between religion and statecraft. Under his leadership, the papacy became embroiled in the dark arts of manipulation, betrayal, and conspiracy. Sixtus IV didn't just rule the church. He wielded it as a tool of personal power, using the Vatican's influence to secure his family's ambitions, manipulate rivals, and expand the papal territories. But while he was a master of church politics, his reign was also defined by some of the bloodiest conflicts in papal history. Sixtus IV's ambition began long before his papacy. As a member of the influential Rovere family, he climbed the ranks of the church through sheer cunning. He was appointed a cardinal in 1467, and his rise was swift. By the time he ascended to the papacy, he was a seasoned political strategist, capable of navigating the treacherous waters of Roman and European power dynamics. But Sixtus wasn't interested in keeping the papacy merely as a religious office. He saw it as a vehicle for dynastic power and personal control. One of his first moves as pope was to build up the fortunes of his family. He made his nephew, Giuliano della Rovere, a cardinal and pushed him into key positions within the church. But it wasn't just nepotism. Sixtus IV was creating a power base that could rival the influence of the great families of Italy. The papacy under Sixtus became a dynasty in the making, with his relatives occupying positions of power both in the church and in secular affairs. But Sixtus IV's papacy was not just about family ambition. It was also about territorial expansion. To consolidate his power, Sixtus sought to increase the territorial holdings of the papal states. Through a series of aggressive political alliances and military campaigns, he worked to expand the papal dominions. His most significant military intervention came in 1479, where he involved the papacy in a complex and brutal war between the Kingdom of Naples and the Kingdom of Sicily. Sixtus used his papal authority to support the forces of Naples, hoping to extend his influence in the region. His intervention caused widespread destruction and loss of life, cementing his reputation as a pope who was willing to shed blood to achieve his political goals. Perhaps the most notorious aspect of Sixtus IV's papacy was his involvement in the infamous Pazzi conspiracy of 1478. This was not just a plot to murder a pope. It was an attempt to overthrow the Medici family, who were the dominant political force in Florence. Sixtus, who had long been at odds with the powerful Medici family, saw an opportunity to weaken their influence by supporting conspiracy to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano during Easter Mass at the Florence Cathedral. The plot was a stunning failure. While Giuliano was killed, Lorenzo narrowly escaped with his life. The conspirators, including members of the powerful Pazzi family, were brutally executed, and their families were destroyed. But while the conspiracy failed, its consequences were profound. Sixtus IV, instead of reigning in his personal vendetta, sought revenge. He excommunicated the entire city of Florence, punishing the population for their loyalty to the Medici family. The excommunication was a brutal political move, a means to punish those who defied the papacy, as well as a reminder to other city-states of the power Sixtus held over them. Florence, under the Medici, resisted, but the damage had been done. Sixtus IV's ruthless pursuit of his political goals left a lasting scar on Italy, further entrenching the divide between the Vatican and the powerful city-states of the time. Though he was a master of political maneuvering, Sixtus IV's reign was also marked by significant religious reform. In particular, he worked to establish more centralized control over the various dioceses and religious orders within the church. But even in this area, his reforms were often tainted by his political ambitions. He appointed family members and allies to key positions within the church, further entrenching his dynastic control over the Vatican. Sixtus IV's papacy, though marked by territorial and familial expansion, was also defined by scandal, betrayal, and bloodshed. His involvement in the papacy conspiracy and his constant scheming to expand papal power turned the Vatican into a center of political intrigue, where alliances were made and broken at a moment's notice. Sixtus turned the papacy into an instrument of war and diplomacy, his reign overshadowed by the violence he had helped orchestrate. By the time of his death in 1484, Sixtus IV had left a divided legacy. He was not a pope remembered for his spiritual enlightenment or religious reform. Instead, he was a pope who wielded the church as a political tool, a man whose actions paved the way for the blood-soaked politics of future papacies. His reign marked the beginning of the Vatican's transformation into a political powerhouse, a shift that would have profound consequences for the future of both the church and Europe. Sixtus IV may have expanded the papal states and enhanced the influence of his family, but his reign also helped sow the seeds of distrust and division within the church. His aggressive politics, combined with his willingness to manipulate religion for personal gain, made him one of the most controversial popes in history. And while Sixtus IV was certainly a force to be reckoned with, he was by no means the last pope to use the papacy for personal and political gain. The papacy would continue to be a battlefield, a place where the highest powers of Europe fought for dominance, and where the Vatican would increasingly be seen not as a holy center, but as a chess piece in a larger political game. Next, we move into the corrupt reign of the infamous Pope Alexander VI, whose name still evokes scandal and controversy, and if Sixtus IV's papacy was defined by political maneuvering, the reign of Pope Alexander VI is defined by a level of corruption so grotesque, so breathtakingly unholy, that it continues to haunt the pages of history to this day. Born Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander VI is perhaps the most infamous pope in history, not just for his personal vices, but for the way he turned the papacy into a family business, one built on manipulation, assassination, incest, and deceit. His papacy didn't just tarnish the reputation of the church. It set the stage for centuries of corruption and scandal. Rodrigo Borgia was born in 1431 in Spain to a noble family. Ambitious from a young age, he quickly rose through the ranks of the church, becoming a cardinal at the age of 25. His rise was not due to spiritual devotion, but to political alliances and his willingness to use any means necessary to secure power. He was known for his charisma, his ruthlessness, and his ability to charm and manipulate those around him. But it wasn't until his election as Pope in 1492, following the death of Pope Innocent VIII, that Borgia's true nature began to emerge. Borgia was elected Pope under the name Alexander VI, and from the moment he took office, he turned the papacy into a vehicle for his own ambitions and those of his family. His first order of business was to secure power for his children, particularly his son Cesare, whom he appointed to high-ranking positions in the church, and his daughter Lucrezia, whom he married off to various political allies, even though rumors of incest between the two were rife. One of the most notorious aspects of Alexander VI's reign was his blatant use of the papacy to secure wealth and power for his family. He made no effort to hide his nepotism. Alexander VI was responsible for appointing several of his relatives to prominent church positions, often bypassing the usual qualifications for office. Cesare Borgia, his son, was made a cardinal at the age of 18, despite his lack of theological training. Lucrezia, his daughter, was married off to powerful families in Italy, consolidating the Borgia family's political power. But it wasn't just his children that Alexander VI elevated. He also appointed various cousins, nephews, and even mistresses to key positions within the Vatican. But it wasn't just nepotism that made Alexander VI so infamous. His papacy was also marked by a series of violent power struggles, many of which were orchestrated by the Borgia family. Cesare Borgia, in particular, was involved in a campaign of murder and manipulation aimed at consolidating the Borgia family's power across Italy. He ruthlessly eliminated rivals and at one point even ordered the murder of his own brother-in-law, the Duke of Gandia, in order to remove a political obstacle. Cesari's violent nature was matched only by his ambition, and under his father's patronage, he became one of the most feared men in Italy. But it was Alexander VI's personal life that truly scandalized Christendom. He was known for his many mistresses, some of whom were said to have been the mothers of his children, and his notorious sexual escapades became a constant source of gossip and scandal. The most infamous of these relationships was with a woman named Venanza dei Catanii, who bore him several children. Alexander VI's indulgence in such affairs was widely known, but what made it even more appalling was the way he used his papal authority to protect and promote his lovers. He even went so far as to publicly acknowledge his illegitimate children, something that was unheard of for a pope. Perhaps the most shocking and enduring scandal of Alexander VI's reign was his alleged incestuous relationship with his daughter, Lucrezia Borgia. Though the exact nature of their relationship remains a topic of historical debate, the rumors surrounding their bond were so pervasive that they tainted both their names for centuries. Lucrezia was married off 3 times to strengthen political alliances, but her marriages were always fraught with intrigue and tragedy. Her first husband was mysteriously poisoned, and her second marriage to Alfonso of Aragon ended in a brutal murder, rumored to have been orchestrated by her father and brother. Lucrezia's life became a web of political manipulation, incestuous rumors, and violence, and the Borgia family's reputation was irrevocably tarnished as a result. Alexander VI didn't just indulge in personal corruption. He used the church as a tool to advance his own political agenda. His papacy was marked by backroom deals with powerful families, most notably the powerful Medici family, and he wasn't above using bribes, murder, and manipulation to secure his goals. Under his leadership, the Vatican became a place of ruthless political maneuvering, where power and wealth were more important than spiritual matters. Alexander VI's use of papal authority to advance his personal and familial interests was an unprecedented abuse of power. His reign stands as one of the most corrupt and scandalous periods in church history. The downfall of Alexander VI came in 1503, when he died suddenly, possibly from poison, though the exact cause of his death remains unclear. His death marked the end of an era of Borgia dominance in the Vatican, but the damage had already been done. His reign had left the papacy in tatters, and the Borgia name would forever be associated with scandal, violence, and corruption. Alexander VI's legacy is one of unbridled corruption. He turned the papacy into a personal fiefdom, using his position to enrich and empower his family at the expense of the church. He was a pope who disregarded any semblance of holiness in favor of raw ambition and ruthless political maneuvering. His reign marked the nadir of papal corruption and set the stage for the eventual Protestant Reformation, which would challenge the authority of the papacy and reshape Europe's religious landscape forever. Next, we turn our attention to Pope Pius IX, a pope who sought to regain the power the Borgias lost, but with a far different method of manipulation. Pope Pius IX's reign, lasting from 1846 to 1878, stands as one of the longest in papal history, and his papacy, though not as scandalous as those of the Borgias, was marked by a far different kind of manipulation. While Alexander VI had turned the papacy into a tool of his family's political ambitions, Pius IX sought to fortify the Vatican's spiritual and temporal authority in a rapidly changing world. But in doing so, he engaged in a kind of political strategy that was no less ambitious or controversial. Pius IX will be remembered not for indulgence or murder, but for his attempts to create a papacy that could withstand the storm of modernity, nationalism, and secularism sweeping across Europe. Born Giovanni Maria Masti Ferretti in 1792, Pius IX was the youngest of 13 children in a noble family. He became a priest at a young age and rose rapidly within the ranks of the church. In 1846, he was elected pope, and his early years in office were marked by initial reform. He opened up the papal states to liberal reforms, listening to calls for freedom and social change. Many of his contemporaries saw in Pius IX a man who would modernize the papacy, who would align it with the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that were taking root across Europe after the upheaval of the French Revolution. However, the political climate of Italy, and Europe more generally, changed dramatically in the late 1840s. Revolutions erupted across Europe, and the Italian peninsula was swept by the tides of nationalism. Italian unification, the process by which the various independent states of the Italian peninsula were united into one nation, was well underway. The rise of powerful nationalists like Giuseppe Garibaldi and Count Cavour challenged not just the political landscape, but the very fabric of papal rule in central Italy. It was this change, this shift from old-world monarchy and feudalism to the nation-state, that led Pius IX to abandon his early liberal inclinations and embrace a more conservative and reactionary stance. As nationalist sentiment grew, so too did the realization that the papacy's political influence was rapidly diminishing. The Papal States, which had existed for over 1,000 years, were under direct threat. In 1870, the Kingdom of Italy captured Rome, marking the end of the Papal States and the beginning of what many refer to as the Roman Question, a long-standing dispute between the Italian government and the Vatican over the status of the Pope's temporal authority. In response to the loss of papal territories and the rising tide of secularism, Pius IX became a staunch defender of the papacy's authority. He declared himself and the papacy to be infallible in matters of doctrine, a declaration that would define much of his legacy. In 1870, the First Vatican Council convened under his direction, and it was there that the dogma of papal infallibility was officially proclaimed. According to this dogma, the Pope is incapable of error when speaking ex cathedra, when issuing an official pronouncement on matters of faith or morals. This was a bold assertion of papal authority in an era when many in Europe were questioning the Church's place in a rapidly modernizing world.
But it wasn't just theological claims that characterized Pius IX's reign. He also used the power of excommunication and condemnation as political tools, often against those who threatened the Church's position. His stance against the modern world was encapsulated in his famous Syllabus of Errors in 1864, a document in which he condemned modernism, rationalism, liberalism, and other intellectual movements that were seen as threatening the Church's authority. Pius IX's papacy thus became a symbol of resistance to the forces of change sweeping through Europe. He stood against the growing power of secular governments and the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, hoping to preserve the power of the papacy in a world that was increasingly hostile to religious authority. Despite his efforts to assert papal power, Pius IX's reign also saw the Vatican's influence diminish in the face of the growing might of the Italian state and the modern, secular world. While he managed to maintain the Church's position in spiritual matters, his loss of the Papal States was a bitter blow, and his battles with the Italian government, while rhetorically powerful, did little to reverse the trends of secularization that were taking place across Europe. He died in 1878, having seen the papacy lose much of its temporal power, and leaving behind a church that was beginning to confront the realities of the modern world. Pius IX's legacy is complex. On one hand, he is remembered as a pope who fiercely defended the Church's authority and its role in spiritual matters. On the other hand, his rejection of the modern world and his obstinate stance against change helped solidify the rift between the Church and the modern state. His papacy also marked a turning point in the history of the Vatican, as the papacy was forced to reconcile with the loss of temporal power and focus increasingly on spiritual leadership alone. The aftermath of Pius IX's papacy would see the Vatican navigate a delicate balance between maintaining its spiritual authority and dealing with the challenges of the secular world. But in the years to come, a new generation of popes would emerge who would seek to bring the Church into the 20th century, though not without the echoes of Pius IX's conservative legacy still reverberating in their policies and decisions. As we look to the future of the papacy, the question remains: what happens when the spiritual leader of the world's largest religion is forced to reckon with the changing tides of modernity, nationalism, and secularism? The legacy of Pius IX would set the stage for the Church's confrontation with these forces, leading to a new era where the Vatican's role in world affairs would evolve yet again. Next up, we turn our attention to the papacy of Pope Pius XII, whose leadership during World War II and his responses to the Holocaust would be one of the most controversial and scrutinized legacies in the history of the Vatican. Pope Pius XII's papacy is one of the most contentious and debated in modern history, a reign that spanned from 1939 to 1958, against the backdrop of World War II, the rise of fascism, and the Holocaust. Pius XII is often portrayed as a man caught between the demands of political neutrality, the preservation of the Catholic Church, and the horrors unfolding in Europe. His actions, or more often his inaction, during the Nazi regime remain subjects of deep scrutiny, as many question whether he did enough to speak out against the atrocities of the Holocaust or whether his diplomatic neutrality enabled the atrocities to continue unchecked. Born Eugenio Pacelli in 1876 in Italy, Pius XII was a man steeped in the complexities of church politics. He was a diplomat by training, and his early career in the Vatican was marked by his keen ability to navigate the murky waters of European diplomacy. Pacelli was appointed Vatican Secretary of State in 1930, and during his tenure in that role, he was instrumental in negotiating the Lateran Treaty in 1929, which recognized the Vatican as an independent state and resolved the long-standing Roman question that had plagued the relationship between the papacy and the Kingdom of Italy. His diplomatic success earned him a reputation as a man capable of working behind the scenes, carefully maneuvering through the political tensions of the time. When Pacelli was elected pope in 1939, he was confronted with an unprecedented crisis. World War II had already begun, and Europe was teetering on the brink of total destruction. As pope, Pius XII immediately understood the gravity of the situation. His primary concern was to protect the Church and maintain its neutral stance amid the rise of fascism and communism. He was deeply aware of the Vatican's delicate position, ensuring the survival of the Church in a rapidly changing and dangerous world. However, Pius XII's approach to the conflict has been controversial ever since. His decision to remain publicly neutral in the face of Nazi atrocities has been criticized by many, both during and after the war. While he worked behind the scenes to try to save Jews and other persecuted groups, his failure to issue strong public statements condemning Hitler and the Nazi regime remains a point of contention. One of the most criticized aspects of Pius XII's papacy is his response to the Holocaust. It is well documented that, during the war, thousands of Jews sought refuge in Catholic institutions across Europe, including churches, convents, and monasteries, many of which were directly protected by the Vatican. Additionally, Pius XII reportedly helped facilitate the escape of thousands of Jews from Nazi-controlled areas, providing them with false identification papers and sheltering them from the Gestapo. The Vatican, under his leadership, was also involved in numerous efforts to help refugees flee Europe to safety. Despite these efforts, Pius XII never publicly condemned the systematic extermination of Jews or spoke out forcefully against the atrocities committed by the Nazis. Instead, he focused on maintaining the Church's neutrality, believing that taking a strong public stand might lead to reprisals against Catholic institutions, particularly in Nazi-occupied territories. Pius XII's strategy was to engage in behind-the-scenes diplomacy, working with neutral countries and attempting to save as many lives as possible without risking the Church's position. The absence of a clear public denunciation of the Holocaust is seen by many as a failure of leadership on Pius XII's part. Some argue that, had he spoken out forcefully, he could have mobilized the international community to act more decisively against Nazi atrocities. Others defend his actions, claiming that Pius XII faced difficult choices and that his primary goal was to preserve the Church as a neutral institution in the face of the rise of totalitarian regimes. Furthermore, Pius XII's relationship with fascist regimes during the war has also been a subject of intense debate. While the Vatican signed a concordat with Nazi Germany in 1933, a diplomatic agreement aimed at ensuring the protection of Catholics in Germany, Pius XII's failure to address the regime's rise to power and its early policies of persecution has been criticized. Some argue that the Pope's desire to maintain the Vatican's neutrality led him to avoid directly confronting the Nazi regime, even as it began its campaign of terror and genocide across Europe.
In the aftermath of World War II, Pius XII faced even more scrutiny. The publication of several books and documents in the decades following his death revealed that, while the Vatican had done much to help Jews and other victims of Nazi persecution, the Pope's refusal to speak out publicly against Hitler's crimes left a stain on his papacy. The Church was criticized for failing to take a stronger moral stance, and Pius XI's legacy became a subject of fierce debate. Some historians have come to Pius XI's defense, arguing that his actions should be viewed in the context of the time. They argue that Pius XII, given the complex political realities of World War II, was doing his best to balance the survival of the Church with the desire to minimize further loss of life. Others, however, believe that his refusal to publicly condemn the Holocaust was a moral failure, one that overshadowed the work he did behind the scenes to protect Jews and other persecuted groups. In the years following his death, Pius XI's legacy has been subject to intense scrutiny. Some have called for his beatification, while others have vehemently opposed it, citing his actions during World War II as evidence of moral cowardice. In the Vatican, his legacy remains divisive, and the debate over his role during the Holocaust continues to shape discussions about the Church's response to moral crises. While Pius XII undoubtedly played a crucial role in preserving the Catholic Church during one of its most perilous periods, his papacy remains marred by questions of moral responsibility and leadership during one of history's darkest chapters. His papacy exemplifies the difficult choices faced by the Church in the 20th century, how to navigate the tensions between political neutrality, spiritual leadership, and the moral obligations of a global institution. Next, we turn to a more modern papacy, the reign of Pope John Paul II, whose leadership not only shaped the Church but had profound global political and spiritual implications. Pope John Paul II, who served as Pope from 1978 until his death in 2005, is perhaps one of the most influential and beloved pontiffs in modern Church history. His papacy was marked by a fervent commitment to traditional Catholic teachings, his tireless advocacy for human rights, and his role in bringing down communism in Eastern Europe. Yet, like all leaders, his legacy is not without controversy. From his handling of the Church's sexual abuse scandals to his stance on birth control and women's ordination, John Paul II's papacy was a complex interplay of faith, politics, and moral conviction that left a profound impact on the world. Born Karol Józef Wojtyła in 1920 in Poland, he came from humble beginnings, experiencing firsthand the pain of war, the devastation of Nazi occupation, and the harshness of Soviet oppression. His early life would profoundly shape his views as a priest, bishop, and ultimately as pope. Wojtyła was deeply influenced by his country's history and his own experiences of suffering, which would later guide his papacy as he navigated the Church's role in a world beset by political upheaval. John Paul II was elected pope on October 16, 1978, at the age of 58, and immediately made history as the first non-Italian pope in over 450 years. His election came at a time when the Church was facing the challenge of modernity. Secularism was on the rise, and the world was struggling with issues such as nuclear warfare, poverty, and the erosion of moral values. John Paul II's arrival in the papacy offered the world a figure of stability, conviction, and hope. His charismatic personality and eloquent speeches made him a beloved figure not only among Catholics, but also among people of many faiths around the globe. One of the defining aspects of John Paul II's papacy was his staunch defense of traditional Catholic doctrine, particularly on matters such as abortion, contraception, and the sanctity of life. He was unwavering in his opposition to artificial contraception, a stance that drew both admiration and criticism. His encyclical Humanae Vitae, issued by his predecessor Paul VI in 1968, continued to be a cornerstone of his own papacy. John Paul II believed that the Church must maintain its position as the moral compass for society, upholding the sanctity of life and the sacredness of marriage as defined by traditional Christian teachings. However, his strong stance on these issues, particularly his condemnation of artificial contraception, alienated many progressive Catholics, particularly those in Western countries. His views on sexual ethics were deeply conservative, and this led to increasing tensions between the Church's teachings and the realities of modern life. In a world where birth control had become widely accessible and divorce rates were rising, John Paul II's unwavering position often left the Church seeming disconnected from the lived experiences of many of its faithful. Despite these controversies, one of the most enduring aspects of John Paul II's papacy was his commitment to human rights. He became an outspoken critic of totalitarian regimes, particularly communism, which he saw as an affront to human dignity and freedom. His experiences growing up in Nazi-occupied Poland and living under the oppressive Soviet regime shaped his belief that the Church had a moral duty to oppose systems that denied basic human rights and freedoms. It was in this context that John Paul II played a pivotal role in the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, particularly in his native Poland. His visit to Poland in 1979, where he delivered the famous message, "Do not be afraid," inspired millions and gave a moral boost to the Solidarity movement, which was fighting against the communist government. His support for solidarity and his ongoing commitment to human rights in Eastern Europe made him a hero to those fighting for freedom and justice. John Paul II's influence in the political sphere was not limited to Eastern Europe. He also played a significant role in fostering dialogue between the Catholic Church and other religious groups. His papacy marked the first time a pope had visited a synagogue, as he did in Rome in 1986, symbolizing his commitment to interfaith dialogue and reconciliation. He also made historic visits to Muslim-majority countries, seeking to build bridges between Christianity and Islam, especially in the wake of the increasing tensions between the two faiths during the 1990s and early 2000s. Yet, as with all powerful figures, John Paul II's papacy was not without its challenges. The sexual abuse scandals that rocked the Catholic Church in the late 20th and early 21st centuries were a shadow that followed him throughout much of his papacy. While John Paul II was not directly involved in the scandals, his failure to act decisively against the perpetrators and hold the church hierarchy accountable has been heavily criticized. His papacy, in many ways, was marked by reluctance to confront the deep, systemic issues within the church that allowed for the abuse to continue unchecked for decades. The silence and inaction from the Vatican on this issue became a defining scandal of John Paul II's legacy. Critics argue that the Church's handling of sexual abuse cases was deeply flawed, and that the Pope failed to take action to protect victims or hold the guilty accountable. This issue would continue to haunt the Church long after his death, as the sexual abuse scandal exploded in the 21st century, forcing the Vatican to confront its darkest chapter. Another point of contention during John Paul II's papacy was his stance on women in the Church. Despite his calls for a greater role for women in Catholic life, John Paul II remained firmly opposed to the ordination of women as priests. This stance alienated many within the Church, particularly those advocating for gender equality. The question of women's roles in the Church remains one of the most divisive issues in contemporary Catholicism. Despite these controversies, John Paul II's papacy is largely seen as one of revitalization for the Catholic Church. He traveled extensively, reaching out to the faithful and bringing a personal touch to the papacy. His numerous pilgrimages, his visits to countries such as the United States, the Philippines, and Latin America, helped solidify his image as a global figure of faith and hope. When John Paul II died in 2005, his death marked the end of an era for the Catholic Church. His funeral was one of the largest gatherings in history, with millions of mourners from around the world coming to honor him. John Paul II's legacy is still felt today, as his influence continues to shape the direction of the Church. Though his papacy was far from flawless, John Paul II remains one of the most admired popes of the modern era. His passionate defense of human dignity, his opposition to communism, his commitment to interfaith dialogue, and his unwavering faith made him a towering figure in the 20th century. He was a pope who guided the Church through some of its darkest days and helped shape the modern world, even as his papacy faced some of its most difficult challenges. Next, we look at the papacy of Pope Francis, the first pope from the global south, whose progressive views and commitment to social justice have made him a widely respected figure in the modern era. His papacy represents a departure from the past and offers a glimpse into the future of the Catholic Church. Pope Francis, elected in 2013, marked a profound shift in the Catholic Church. As the first pope from Latin America and the first Jesuit pope in history, his papacy has brought with it a wave of change, characterized by a renewed focus on social justice, humility, and outreach to the marginalized. His leadership represents a departure from the more conservative papacies of his predecessors, particularly in terms of approachability, transparency, and his emphasis on the Church's mission to serve the poor and vulnerable. Born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in 1936, Pope Francis grew up in a working-class family of Italian immigrants. His early life was shaped by the struggles of post-World War II Argentina, where political and economic instability were rampant. He joined the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, in 1958, and through his religious training, he developed a deep commitment to both intellectual rigor and social service. Before becoming pope, Bergoglio served as the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, where he was known for his humility, simplicity, and deep concern for the poor. He was beloved by many for his accessibility and his efforts to reach out to those on the fringes of society. When Bergoglio was elected pope in 2013, the world was watching, eager to see what direction the Catholic Church would take under his leadership. Pope Francis immediately made waves by rejecting the ornate papal trappings that his predecessors had embraced. Instead of staying in the Apostolic Palace, he chose to live in the modest Domus Sancti Marthi guest house. He wore simple white cassocks, forgoing the usual gold or red accents, and was often seen greeting people in unassuming ways, whether it was kissing the feet of refugees or taking the time to engage with the poor in Rome. His humility was refreshing in stark contrast to the lavish lifestyles of many church leaders, and it resonated deeply with both Catholics and non-Catholics alike. One of the defining features of Pope Francis's papacy has been his emphasis on social justice. He has consistently used his platform to speak out against inequality, poverty, and environmental degradation that disproportionately affects the poor. His landmark encyclical Laudato Si, issued in 2015, focused on the need for global environmental stewardship. In this document, he called for urgent action to address climate change, noting that the poor are most affected by environmental issues, and stressing the moral imperative to care for the earth as a sacred trust. His focus on the environment and the poor was not only a call for action, but a reminder that the Catholic Church must be a force for compassion and justice in a world marked by economic disparities and ecological crises. Pope Francis's papacy has also been marked by his efforts to open up dialogue with other religious groups. His ecumenical outreach has been a hallmark of his leadership. In 2016, he made a historic trip to Sweden to mark the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, reaching out to the Lutheran community with a message of reconciliation. He has also worked to strengthen ties with the Eastern Orthodox Church and has met with numerous leaders of other faiths, emphasizing the importance of interfaith dialogue and cooperation in addressing the global challenges of the 21st century. In addition to his focus on social issues, Pope Francis has been a vocal advocate for reforming the Catholic Church's internal governance. He has taken significant steps to address the Church's sexual abuse crisis, which has plagued the Vatican for decades. Under his leadership, the Church has implemented new policies to hold abusive clergy accountable, and he has created a commission to advise on how to better protect children and vulnerable adults. Despite criticism from some conservative factions within the Church, Pope Francis has continued to emphasize the need for transparency and accountability within the Vatican.
However, Pope Francis's progressive stances on certain issues have also sparked controversy. His more open approach to issues like divorce and remarriage, as well as his willingness to engage with LGBTQ+ issues, has drawn criticism from traditionalists within the Church. His efforts to broaden the conversation around topics such as family, mercy, and compassion are seen by some as challenging long-standing doctrinal positions. For example, his apostolic exhortation Amoris Laetitia, published in 2016, discussed the possibility of allowing divorced and remarried Catholics to receive communion, a controversial issue that has divided the Church. While he advocates for pastoral sensitivity, especially toward those who feel marginalized or excluded, his views have sparked ongoing debates about the balance between Church teachings and pastoral care. Pope Francis's handling of the Church's relationship with women has also been a point of tension. While he has made strides toward acknowledging the vital role women play in the life of the Church, such as creating female advisory positions and giving women a more visible role in Vatican councils, he has not moved forward with the question of female ordination. His reluctance to allow women to become priests remains a sticking point for many, particularly among Catholics who believe that ordaining women would be a crucial step toward achieving gender equality within the Church. Nevertheless, Pope Francis has been vocal about the need for women to have more significant roles in the leadership of the Church, even if they are not ordained. One of the most striking features of Pope Francis's papacy has been his ability to connect with people from all walks of life. Whether meeting with world leaders, speaking to impoverished communities, or offering words of comfort to the sick and suffering, Pope Francis has consistently emphasized the need for compassion, humility, and mercy. His ability to engage with individuals and groups on a personal level, breaking down barriers between the Vatican and the wider world, has endeared him to millions. He has become a global ambassador for peace, love, and justice, advocating for the protection of human dignity and the sanctity of life. Pope Francis's papacy has not been without its challenges. His efforts to bring about change within the Church have often met resistance, both from conservative factions and from those who believe he is too lenient on matters of doctrine. Nevertheless, his leadership represents a significant shift in the Catholic Church, one that emphasizes openness, humility, and compassion over dogma and tradition. His focus on issues like poverty, the environment, and interfaith dialogue has positioned the Catholic Church as a leading voice for social justice in the modern world. Looking to the future, Pope Francis has set the stage for a Church that is more engaged with the world and its most pressing issues, while remaining deeply rooted in its core spiritual mission. As the Church continues to face the challenges of secularization, globalization, and internal reform, Pope Francis's papacy offers a glimpse into a new direction, one that prioritizes love, inclusivity, and social responsibility as the foundation of the Church's message in the 21st century. Next, we move on to the final section of our journey, exploring the papacy of Pope Benedict XVI, a man whose intellectual rigor and conservative views made him a pivotal figure in the Church's modern history. Pope Benedict XVI, born Joseph Ratzinger in 1927, became the 265th Pope of the Roman Catholic Church in 2005, following the death of Pope John Paul II. His papacy, while relatively short, lasting just 8 years before his resignation in 2013, was marked by a profound intellectual depth, theological conservatism, and a staunch defense of traditional Catholic doctrine. His tenure came at a time of significant challenge for the Church, both externally with rising secularism and dwindling influence in Europe, and internally with the ongoing sexual abuse scandals that rocked the Vatican. Ratzinger's early life and education would shape the direction of his papacy. Born in Marktal am in Germany, he grew up in a devout Catholic family and was deeply influenced by the turbulent political climate of World War II and its aftermath. As a young man, Ratzinger entered the seminary, where his academic brilliance quickly became apparent. He was ordained a priest in 1951 and soon became known for his theological scholarship. He earned his doctorate in theology and became a professor of dogmatic theology, writing extensively on matters of faith, liturgy, and the relationship between the Church and the modern world. Ratzinger's intellectual rigor earned him the respect of many in the Catholic Church, and in 1981 he was appointed prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, CDF, the Vatican office responsible for safeguarding Catholic doctrine. In this position he became known as a staunch defender of traditional Catholic teachings, particularly on issues such as contraception, divorce, and the role of women in the Church. His work at the CDF was often controversial, as he took a hardline stance on doctrinal matters, ensuring that dissent within the Church was met with firm opposition. Under his leadership, the CDF condemned liberation theology, certain forms of ecumenism, and other theological movements seen as deviating from traditional Catholic orthodoxy. When Pope John Paul II died in 2005, Ratzinger was elected pope in a conclave that was both a moment of transition and of continuity. As Pope Benedict XVI, he inherited a church that was facing significant challenges. The rise of secularism, particularly in Europe, and the increasing decline of religious vocations threatened the traditional influence of the Vatican. Furthermore, the Church was reeling from the sexual abuse scandals, with numerous cases of clergy sexual abuse surfacing in various countries. Benedict's approach to these crises was methodical and cautious, but it also invited criticism for being slow and insufficient in addressing the deeper structural issues that allowed abuse to flourish in the Church. One of the central themes of Benedict XVI's papacy was his commitment to the hermeneutic of continuity, a theological framework that sought to reconcile the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, 1962–1965, with traditional Catholic doctrine. The Vatican II reforms, which had introduced significant changes in church practices and teachings, such as vernacular liturgy and ecumenism, were seen by some traditionalists as too radical. Benedict XVI sought to reaffirm the teachings of Vatican II while also restoring elements of pre-Vatican II tradition, such as the Latin Mass and a more rigid stance on doctrinal purity. This balancing act created tension within the Church, as progressives and traditionalists clashed over the direction of the Vatican. One of Benedict's most notable acts as Pope was his outreach to other Christian denominations.
In 2007, he issued the Motu Proprio Summorum Pontificum, which allowed for greater use of the Latin Mass, a move that was seen as a victory for traditionalist Catholics who preferred the pre-Vatican II liturgy. He also sought to improve relations with the Orthodox Church, a long-standing division within Christianity, and took steps to strengthen ties with the Anglican Communion. While these efforts were often met with both praise and criticism, they were part of Benedict's broader goal to strengthen the unity of the Church and reaffirm its traditional doctrines. Perhaps one of the most defining aspects of Benedict XVI's papacy was his emphasis on the spiritual and intellectual life of the Church. He was a pope who valued reason, philosophy, and theological reflection. His teachings were often dense and intellectual, focusing on issues such as the relationship between faith and reason, the importance of personal conversion, and the role of the Church in an increasingly secular world. Benedict's writings, particularly his encyclicals Deus Caritas Estate, God is Love, Spe Salvi, Save in Hope, and Caritas in Veritate, Charity and Truth, offered deep theological insights on the nature of God's love, the Christian hope for salvation, and the ethical responsibilities of the faithful in a globalized world. Benedict also made strides in the areas of interfaith dialogue, particularly with Judaism and Islam. His famous Regensburg lecture in 2006, however, caused controversy due to remarks that were seen as critical of Islam, leading to a temporary diplomatic crisis with the Muslim world. Despite this, Benedict remained committed to interfaith dialogue. though his approach was often cautious and marked by a desire to reaffirm the unique role of Christianity in the world's spiritual landscape. Benedict's papacy was also marked by his handling of the Church's sexual abuse crisis. Though he personally met with victims and sought to address the issue in some countries, his efforts were often seen as too little, too late. Critics argue that Benedict's papacy failed to fully confront the depth of the abuse scandal, particularly in terms of holding bishops accountable for covering up abuse. His failure to fully engage with the issue during the early years of his papacy has been a major point of contention, even as the Vatican under his leadership made efforts to reform policies and offer compensation to victims. In 2013, at the age of 85, Benedict XVI shocked the world by becoming the first pope in nearly 600 years to resign. Citing his declining health and the demands of the papacy, he stepped down, creating a rare moment of transition in the history of the Church. His resignation was a moment of humility and self-awareness, as Benedict acknowledged that the papacy required a level of physical and mental strength that he could no longer provide. His decision to retire from active ministry and live in seclusion was unprecedented, and it paved the way for Pope Francis to take the helm of the Catholic Church. Pope Benedict XVI's legacy is a complicated one. On one hand, he is remembered for his intellectual contributions to theology and his unwavering defense of Catholic tradition in a rapidly changing world. On the other hand, his failure to adequately address the sexual abuse crisis and his more conservative stance on issues such as contraception and women's roles in the Church have made him a polarizing figure. Nonetheless, his papacy marked a significant period in the Church's history as he sought to navigate the tensions between tradition and modernity while dealing with some of the most pressing challenges the Church had ever faced. As we reflect on Benedict XVI's papacy, we are reminded of the complexities inherent in leading the Catholic Church, a global institution with over 1 billion followers. His papacy was one of intellectual rigor, doctrinal fidelity, and deep faith, but it was also one marked by struggles of the Church's most significant internal crises. His resignation, a historic event, demonstrated the personal humility and awareness that characterized much of his pontificate, leaving a Church in transition and ready for new direction under Pope Francis. In the next and final section, we look at the legacy of Pope Francis, continuing his work of reform and facing the challenges that lie ahead for Catholic Church in the modern world. Pope Francis's papacy marks a pivotal moment in the history of the Catholic Church, not just in terms of leadership, but in terms of vision. Elected in 2013, his tenure has been defined by his desire to take the Church into a new era, one that emphasizes compassion, mercy, and social justice, all while confronting some of the most profound issues facing the modern world. As the first pope from Latin America and the first Jesuit pope in history, Pope Francis has brought a fresh perspective to the Vatican, reimagining what it means to lead the largest Christian denomination in a rapidly changing global context. Pope Benedict XVI's legacy is a complicated one. On one hand, he is remembered for his intellectual contributions to theology and his unwavering defense of Catholic tradition in a rapidly changing world. On the other hand, his failure to adequately address the sexual abuse crisis and his more conservative stance on issues such as contraception and women's roles in the Church have made him a polarizing figure. Nonetheless, his papacy marked a significant period in the Church's history as he sought to navigate the tensions between tradition and modernity while dealing with some of the most pressing challenges the Church had ever faced. As we reflect on Benedict XVI's papacy, we are reminded of the complexities inherent in leading the Catholic Church, a global institution with over 1 billion followers. His papacy was one of intellectual rigor, doctrinal fidelity, and deep faith, but was also one marked by struggles with the Church's most significant internal crises. His resignation, a historic event, demonstrated the personal humility and awareness that characterized much of his pontificate, leaving a Church in transition and ready for the new direction under Pope Francis. In the next and final section, we look at the legacy of Pope Francis, continuing his work of reform and facing the challenges that lie ahead for the Catholic Church in the modern world. Pope Francis's papacy marks a pivotal moment in the history of the Catholic Church, not just in terms of leadership, but in terms of vision. Elected in 2013, his tenure has been defined by his desire to take the Church into a new era, one that emphasizes compassion, mercy, and social justice, all while confronting some of the most profound issues facing the modern world. As the first pope from Latin America and the first Jesuit pope in history, Pope Francis has brought a fresh perspective to the Vatican, reimagining what it means to lead the largest Christian denomination in a rapidly changing global context. One of the most striking aspects of Pope Francis's papacy is his commitment to humility. From the very beginning, he eschewed many of the traditional symbols of papal authority. He chose not to live in the apostolic palace, instead opting for a modest guest house. His simple white cassock, without the usual gold embroidery, was a visible sign of his rejection of the trappings of power. His personal style, warm, approachable, and deeply human, has resonated with millions of Catholics and non-Catholics alike, signaling a departure from the more distant, formal papacies of the past. Pope Francis's leadership is rooted in his Jesuit background, and he brings a distinctive perspective to the papacy that emphasizes pastoral care, intellectual engagement, and a deep sense of social responsibility. His formation in the Society of Jesus is evident in his emphasis on the summit, dialogue, and a focus on the marginalized. As a Jesuit, he has often said that the preferential option for the poor should be the guiding principle of the Church's mission, and his papacy has been marked by a clear commitment to addressing social, economic, and environmental justice. One of the defining moments of Pope Francis's papacy came with the release of his encyclical Laudato Si in 2015, which called on the world to address the ecological crisis, particularly climate change. In this groundbreaking document, Pope Francis emphasized the moral imperative of caring for creation, stressing that environmental degradation disproportionately affects the poorest communities, and that we, as stewards of the earth, have a sacred duty to protect the environment. His call to action resonated far beyond the Church, and he was widely praised by environmentalists, world leaders, and other faith communities for framing climate change as not just a scientific or political issue, but a spiritual and ethical one. Pope Francis's approach to interfaith dialogue has also been a hallmark of his papacy. He has made historic efforts to reach out to people of other faiths, particularly Islam and Judaism, emphasizing the importance of peaceful coexistence, mutual respect, and cooperation. His 2016 visit to the Al-Azhar University in Cairo, a leading institution in Sunni Islam, was a major milestone in Catholic-Muslim relations. Pope Francis's willingness to engage with other religions, while affirming Catholic teaching, has made him a significant figure in the global conversation about religious tolerance and peace. In addition to his emphasis on social issues, Pope Francis has also made efforts to reform the Vatican and address the scandals that have plagued the Church in recent decades. One of the most pressing challenges of his papacy has been the sexual abuse crisis. Under his leadership, the Vatican has taken concrete steps to hold perpetrators accountable and to provide support for victims. Pope Francis has spoken candidly about the need for transparency and justice, and he has taken steps to establish policies that will better protect minors and vulnerable adults within the Church. However, his efforts to address the abuse crisis have been met with both praise and criticism. While he has made strides in confronting the issue, many believe that more must be done to fully address the systemic problems within the Church that allowed abuse to persist for so long. Pope Francis has also been a vocal advocate for the Church's role in promoting peace and justice in the world. He has used his platform to speak out against war, violence, and inequality. His calls for peace in places like Syria and Ukraine, and his efforts to mediate in conflict around the world, have positioned the Vatican as a voice for diplomacy and nonviolence. His support for refugees and immigrants, particularly during the European migrant crisis, has been a defining feature of his papacy. Pope Francis has consistently called for compassion and solidarity with the displaced, urging countries to open their doors to those fleeing violence and poverty. Despite his many achievements, Pope Francis's papacy has not been without its challenges. His progressive stance on social justice, environmental issues, and interfaith dialogue has drawn criticism from more conservative factions within the Church. His openness to greater inclusion of divorced and remarried Catholics, his outreach to the LGBTQ+ community, and his calls for reform on issues such as women's roles in the Church have created tension between traditionalists and progressives within the Vatican. Nonetheless, Pope Francis has remained committed to his vision of a Church that is merciful, inclusive, and deeply engaged with the world's most pressing issues. Pope Francis's papacy is one of profound transformation. While he has faced significant resistance from certain corners of the Church, his focus on mercy, social justice, and reform has reshaped the way the Church engages with the modern world. Under his leadership, the Catholic Church has made strides toward becoming more compassionate, more inclusive, and more attuned to the needs of the poor and marginalized. His papacy is marked by his ability to connect with people on a deeply personal level, speaking to the heart of the human experience and offering hope to those who are struggling. Whether he's embracing the sick, washing the feet of refugees, or speaking out against inequality and environmental destruction, Pope Francis's leadership continues to inspire millions around the world. As we look to the future of the Catholic Church, Pope Francis's legacy will undoubtedly be a major factor in shaping its direction. His calls for reform, his commitment to social justice, and his desire to make the Church a force for good in the world will continue to resonate for years to come. Whether he is remembered as a prophet for the modern world or as a man ahead of his time, Pope Francis's papacy represents a turning point in the Church's history, one that emphasizes the core values of love, mercy, and compassion in a world that desperately needs them. In the end, Pope Francis's papacy offers a glimpse into a more inclusive and compassionate church, one that seeks to heal the wounds of the world, protect the vulnerable, and offer hope to all who are in need.